My ex-husband invited me to his wedding to humiliate me in front of 400 elite guests. He even paid for my travel, just to ensure I would be there to witness his fake triumph. He had absolutely no idea that I would arrive at his luxury venue in a midnight black Rolls Royce Phantom, bringing two highly specific people who would permanently end his wedding, his fraudulent engagement, and his freedom in less than 10 minutes. My name is Madeline, 33 years old, and a financial risk analyst. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of a toxic betrayal while secretly plotting the ultimate legal consequence for the person who tried to destroy you. The thick tires of my rented Rolls Royce crunched against the pristine white gravel of the sprawling Napa Valley vineyard. The late afternoon California sun bathed the $2 million reception in a golden hue, making the endless rows of grapevines look like they were glowing. I could see the massive white tents imported from Italy, the crystal chandeliers hanging precariously from ancient oak trees, and the valet stand swarming with imported sports cars and luxury sedans. I was not supposed to be here to celebrate. I was supposed to be the pathetic punchline of a very expensive, cruel joke. Preston, my narcissistic ex-husband, had orchestrated this entire lavish spectacle to prove to his investors and his new bride that he was the ultimate winner. As my driver approached the main drop-off area, a valet in a crisp white uniform stepped directly in front of the vehicle, raising a white-gloved hand to halt us. He jogged over to my side of the car, his eyes scanning a digital tablet. When I lowered the heavy tinted glass, his polite customer service smile vanished, instantly replaced by a practiced, condescending sneer. He leaned down, looking right past me. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with a forced, rehearsed courtesy. "I have very strict specific orders directly from the groom regarding your arrival today." He instructed the security team to explicitly ban the ex-wife's cheap rental car from the main driveway. "You are not allowed to drop off here. You will have to take this vehicle down to the dirt lot behind the catering vans and walk up the service hill." Those words were carefully scripted by Preston to humiliate me right out of the gate, to make me feel small and insignificant in front of the arriving high society crowd. But as I stared at the valet's smug face, I did not feel the familiar sting of embarrassment. I did not feel the urge to cry or retreat. Instead, my mind flashed back to a freezing rain-soaked evening exactly 1 year ago. I remembered standing on the soaking wet welcome mat of the luxury downtown penthouse, the exact same penthouse I had drained my own savings to pay the down payment for. Preston had legally changed the locks while I was at the office pulling a 14-hour shift. When I banged on the heavy mahogany door, shivering and drenched to the bone, he did not even have the decency to face me. He simply slid my work laptop out into the hallway through a side door and told me through the security intercom that a boring numbers cruncher like me was dragging down his visionary potential. He left me stranded in that cold hallway with nothing but the wet clothes on my back and the complex financial algorithms I had built from scratch. He truly believed he broke me that night. He thought I was just a weak, dependent woman who would quietly walk away, rent a cheap studio apartment, and cry into a spreadsheet for the rest of my life. But a financial risk analyst knows exactly how to calculate the compound interest of total destruction. I pulled my attention back to the present moment, looking at the valet who was still tapping his foot, waiting for me to surrender and command my driver to turn the heavy vehicle around in shame. I did not break eye contact. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the thick gold foil wedding invitation Preston had maliciously mailed to my office as a sick taunt. I placed the heavy cardstock directly into the valet's hand, sliding a crisp, freshly printed $100 bill right underneath it. The valet swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the cash to my $80,000 custom gown, suddenly realizing I was not the broke, defeated woman he had been warned about. "You will park this car in the primary VIP spot, right up front," I said evenly, my voice devoid of any emotion. Then I glanced up at the rearview mirror, making direct eye contact with the two men sitting in the shadowy back seat of the Rolls Royce. "Stay completely out of sight until my signal," I whispered. The heavy car door swung open, and I stepped onto the pristine gravel. The late afternoon breeze caught the edge of my $80,000 custom silk gown. This was not a dress you could rent. It was a statement piece, crafted by a Parisian fashion house, paid for by the very trading profits Preston thought he had stolen from me. I smoothed my skirt, adjusted my diamond bracelet, and began my slow ascent up the marble staircase toward the main reception terrace. At the top of the stairs, holding court before a wall of white roses, stood Preston. He was 36 years old but still possessed the desperate energy of a frat boy. Clinging to his arm was Lexi, 24 years old, pouting her lips for a videographer capturing content for her 2 million followers. She wore a suffocatingly tight mermaid dress that looked more appropriate for a nightclub VIP section than a vineyard wedding. Preston spotted me immediately. His media-ready smile vanished, replaced by a furious scowl. He abandoned a conversation with two wealthy investors and stomped toward the stairs, pulling Lexi along. He wanted a public spectacle, ensuring his elite guests saw him put his discarded ex-wife back in her rightful place. Madeline Preston announced, his voice booming artificially loud so the surrounding venture capitalists would stop and listen. "I am shocked you showed up. I see you blew your entire pity alimony check on a luxury rental dress. Did they ask for a security deposit, or did you just leave your dignity at the rental counter?" A few of his sycophantic friends chuckled. Lexi let out a very high-pitched theatrical laugh, covering her mouth with a hand weighed down by a massive flashy diamond that I already knew had been financed on credit. "There is a seating chart by the entrance." Preston continued, stepping closer to block my path. "I told the event coordinator to put you at table 42. It is right next to the swinging kitchen doors. Try not to get your rented silk stained by the busboys clearing the dishes. We do not have any room for your past baggage at the VIP tables tonight." The courtyard went quiet. The wealthy investors standing nearby paused their conversations, watching me like a hawk, waiting to see if I would crumble under the public humiliation. Instead of shrinking, I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, until I was close enough to smell the cheap cologne masking his nervous sweat. I looked him up and down, my eyes performing a slow, clinical assessment of his entire existence. "Actually, Preston," I replied, my voice completely level and projecting clearly across the silent terrace, "I find it utterly fascinating that you are lecturing me on financial allocation when you are wearing a cheap suit that perfectly mirrors your latest Series A funding round. It looks impressive from 30 feet away, but upon closer inspection, it is completely devoid of actual substance." Preston blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden pivot in conversation. "What the hell are you talking about?" He snapped, his face flushing red. I reached out and lightly flicked the lapel of his tuxedo jacket. "A high-yield junk bond wrapped in synthetic polyester," I said firmly, maintaining a polite, devastating smile. "You told these esteemed gentlemen you were wearing bespoke Italian worsted wool. But the stiffness in the shoulder seam and the chemical sheen of the lapel indicates a cheap rayon blend, likely bulk ordered. Much like your business model, Preston. You are trying to pass off a high-risk, low-equity asset as a premium investment. If I were your lead investor, I would be deeply concerned about your liquidity if you cannot even afford a decent tailor for your own wedding day." The silence that followed was deafening. The two elderly investors Preston had just been trying to impress suddenly exchanged a very sharp, very concerned look. Preston's face quickly turned a very ugly shade of magenta. His mouth opened and then closed, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado, desperately struggling to find a comeback to a mathematical insult he could barely comprehend. Before he could stammer out a single defense, a shrill, piercing voice shattered the tension. "Let me see her. Where is the ungrateful wretch who thinks she can ruin my son's perfect day?" I turned my head slowly. Marching down the sweeping marble staircase was Preston's mother, Elaine. Her face was twisted into a vicious scowl, her eyes narrowed with pure hatred. She was flanked by three of her equally bitter, diamond-clad friends from the local country club, marching in formation like a wealthy, venomous firing squad, absolutely ready to tear me apart right now, no matter who was watching. Elaine stopped a mere foot away from me, her chest heaving underneath a garish floral silk dress that looked like it belonged on a cheap resort buffet line. She pointed a manicured finger right at my face, completely ignoring the fact that half of the arriving guests were now openly staring at us. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here today, Madeline." Elaine spat, her voice echoing sharply across the gravel courtyard. "But then again, you always did lack basic social awareness." I told Preston from the very beginning that marrying a girl from your background was a massive mistake. I suppose spending your entire life staring at spreadsheets turns you into a cold, calculating robot. No wonder my son had to find a real woman. I stood perfectly still, letting her venom wash over me. I did not break eye contact. Elaine took my silence as submission and raised her voice even louder, tilting her head back to ensure Lexi could hear her from the top of the stairs. Preston needed warmth. He needed a wife who actually knows how to be a woman, someone with youthful fertility, who can actually give me beautiful grandchildren. Not a barren, miserable workaholic who treats a marriage like a corporate merger. You never belonged in our world. The word barren hung heavily in the air. A few wealthy guests nearby gasped at the sheer cruelty of the statement. But looking at Elaine's smug, powdered face, all I could focus on was the thick diamond choker sparkling around her neck. It reminded me of a charity gala 3 years ago. I had been planning to wear my late grandmother's antique pearl necklace, the only genuine heirloom I possessed, and a piece I treasured deeply. But when I went to my jewelry box that evening, it was completely empty. Elaine had simply walked into my bedroom, taken the pearls without asking, and worn them to the gala herself. When I confronted her the next morning, she had laughed right in my face, telling me that a plain, uncultured girl like me lacked the class to pull off such an elegant piece, and that the pearls belonged on a true society woman. She never returned them, and Preston had told me to stop causing drama over old jewelry. She thought she could just take whatever she wanted from me. She thought she could rewrite history to make me the bitter villain. "Are you even listening to me?" Elaine demanded, stepping closer, her breath smelling faintly of gin and expensive mints. "You are going to turn around, get back in that ridiculous rental car, and leave before you ruin my son's perfect day. You are nothing but an embarrassment." I smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the sharp, practiced smile of a predator who had just cornered her prey in the wild. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, completely invading Elaine's personal space. Her 3 country club friends instinctively took a step back, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "Elaine," I said quietly, my tone conversational but laced with absolute ice. "You are being very loud for a woman who is hiding a massive federal secret." Elaine scoffed, though her eyes darted nervously from side to side. "I do not know what you are talking about. You are completely delusional." I leaned in close, letting my voice drop to a deadly whisper meant only for her ears. "I know exactly what you did last November, Elaine. I know that while your husband was lying in a hospital bed recovering from his bypass surgery, you forged his signature and illegally drained his entire retirement 401k account." Elaine froze. Her jaw locked, and the color began to rapidly drain from her face. "You see," I continued, keeping my voice silky and perfectly calm, "when you are a financial risk analyst who manages the family accounts, you notice when $200,000 vanishes into thin air. And you definitely notice when it is immediately wired to an offshore casino holding company to cover a massive secret online gambling debt." Elaine opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked like she had just been struck by a freight train. Her hands began to tremble violently. "If you ever speak to me like that again," I whispered, leaning back just enough to look her directly in her terrified eyes, "I will not just tell your husband. I will hand the digital wire transfer receipts directly to the Internal Revenue Service. They have very strict penalties for wire fraud." Elaine let out a strangled, wheezing gasp, clutching her chest. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into one of her stunned friends, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. I did not wait for a response. I smoothed the delicate fabric of my $80,000 gown, gave her silent friends a polite, dismissive nod, and walked right past the paralyzed woman. Leaving Elaine gasping for air on the marble steps, I confidently stepped through the grand oak doors and into the viper's nest of the cocktail reception. The grand oak doors closed heavily behind me, muffling the sound of Elaine's panicked wheezing on the terrace. I stepped fully into the $2 million cocktail reception, walking onto a floor made of imported Italian marble. Preston had spared absolutely no expense trying to convince the world he was a titan of industry. Giant ice sculptures carved into the shape of swans dominated the room. Waiters circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. A live string quartet played classical music from a balcony above. But the moment I entered, the music seemed to fade beneath the collective whispers of the Napa Valley elite. They all knew who I was, the discarded first wife, the financial risk analyst who supposedly lacked the vision to keep up with Preston's meteoric rise. I kept my chin perfectly leveled, projecting an aura of absolute invulnerability as I navigated through the sea of designer suits and expensive perfumes. I was making my way toward the open bar when I spotted her out of the corner of my eye. Caroline, Preston's older sister and Lexi's newly appointed maid of honor. Caroline had always been a deeply insecure woman, constantly desperate for the approval of high society, masking her vicious jealousy behind fake smiles and backhanded compliments. Today, she was squeezed into a hideous, tightly corseted bridesmaid dress that looked like a shiny pink sausage casing. She was standing with three other bridesmaids, whispering aggressively while glaring in my direction. In her right hand, she held a massive crystal goblet overfilled with dark, heavy red Pinot Noir. I watched as she gave the other women a subtle conspiratorial nod. It was a play straight out of a teenage high school drama playbook. Caroline began to march directly toward me, her eyes locked onto the bodice of my custom silk gown. Her intention was blindingly obvious. She was going to bump into me and ruin the dress, ensuring I looked like a stained, humiliated mess for the rest of the evening. I did not alter my pace. I walked casually, holding my designer clutch, appearing completely oblivious to her approach. Caroline picked up her speed, narrowing the gap. When she was less than 3 feet away, she suddenly let out a loud, theatrical gasp. She pretended to trip over an invisible crease in the thick Persian rug. She lunged forward violently, thrusting the overfilled glass of red wine directly toward my chest. But she severely underestimated my reflexes. My entire career was built on anticipating disastrous trajectories and executing split-second evasive maneuvers. In one smooth, fluid motion, I planted my right heel and pivoted my body sharply to the left. Caroline stumbled past me, completely losing her balance as she swiped at empty air. The thick wave of dark red wine missed my silk gown by mere inches. Instead of hitting me, the wine flew through the air in a violent arc and splattered forcefully against the wall directly behind where I had just been standing. The sound of the shattering crystal goblet hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, completely silencing the string quartet. But the broken glass was not the problem. The real disaster was what the wine had hit. Hanging on the wall was a massive ornate oil painting. It was an authentic 18th century antique portrait that the resort had proudly displayed, adding an air of old money prestige to the room. Now a massive spreading stain of dark red Pinot Noir was seeping directly into the ancient canvas, permanently ruining the priceless artwork. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of wealthy guests. The venue manager, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, practically sprinted across the room. His face turned completely ashen as he stared at the ruined masterpiece. He threw his hands up to his head in absolute horror. "Oh my God," the manager gasped, his voice trembling with sheer panic as he looked from the dripping canvas to the broken glass. "That painting is an original piece on loan from a private collection. It is valued at $50,000. For a fraction of a second, Caroline looked genuinely terrified. She stared at her empty wine-stained hand, and then up at the ruined $50,000 antique. She knew Preston's company was deeply in debt, and she definitely knew she did not have the cash to cover such a catastrophic mistake. But Caroline had spent her entire life deflecting blame. Her fear instantly morphed into a calculated, vicious smirk. She dropped to her knees, let out a fake dramatic sob, and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "She pushed me," Caroline screamed, her voice echoing shrilly through the dead-silent ballroom. "Madeline purposely shoved me into the wall. Make her pay for it." The echo of Caroline's accusation hung in the stifling air of the ballroom. Guests began to whisper, their eyes darting between the ruined $50,000 painting and my perfectly unblemished gown. Before the venue manager could even ask what had actually happened, the crowd parted aggressively. Preston stormed through the sea of onlookers, his face flushed with rage. Lexi trailed closely behind him, clutching her massive wedding dress and putting on a theatrical display of distress, dramatically fanning her face, as if the sheer stress of the situation might cause her to faint. Preston did not bother to check on Caroline, who was still kneeling on the floor, pretending to cry. He did not ask the manager for an assessment of the situation. He marched directly up to me, his jaw tightly clenched, and looked from the dripping red canvas back to my face. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Preston hissed, his voice projecting loud enough for the entire VIP section to hear. "You come into my wedding venue, you harass my mother out in the parking lot, and now you are physically assaulting my sister and destroying priceless property? I always knew you were a bitter woman, Madeline, but this is downright pathetic even for you." I stood my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not touch her, Preston. She intentionally tripped over her own feet while trying to throw her drink on my dress. "Do not lie to me in front of my guests," he shouted, taking another aggressive step forward to physically intimidate me into shrinking away. "Look at the massive damage you just caused. That is a $50,000 antique artwork. You are paying for every single cent of that, or I am having my private security team drag you out of here right now and handing you over to the local police for felony vandalism." He paused, letting a cruel, arrogant smirk spread across his face as he looked around at his wealthy venture capitalist friends, making sure they were watching his display of dominance. "Actually, let us be entirely realistic for a moment here. You do not have $50,000. You probably do not even have $500 in your pathetic little checking account right now. What are you going to do, Madeline? Are you going to go crying to your boss at that boring mid-level financial firm and ask for a cash advance on your meager little salary?" As he laughed at his own cruel insult, my mind instantly drifted back to the cramped, unheated apartment we shared 5 years ago. I remembered sitting at a wobbly folding card table at 2 in the morning, my fingers cramping in the freezing air as I typed line after line of complex Python code. I built the high-frequency trading algorithm from absolute scratch. I designed the predictive market models. I ran the endless backtests while he slept soundly in the next room. And when it finally worked, when the code began generating massive simulated returns, Preston took my flash drive to a legal clinic and secretly patented the entire system under his own name. He stole my life's work, kicked me out of my own home, and built his entire fake Silicon Valley empire on the back of my exhausted, sleepless nights. He had the absolute audacity to stand here and call my salary meager, completely unaware that the very foundation of his current wealth was just a stolen house of cards. I did not feel anger as I looked at his smug, ignorant face. I felt absolute icy pity. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for me to break down, crying in front of the crowd. Instead, I calmly unclasped my designer clutch. I ignored him entirely and turned my attention directly to the panicked venue manager who was still sweating profusely while staring at the ruined canvas. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the murmurs of the ballroom. "I apologize for the disruption to your beautiful event space. Please add the full cost of the painting plus a 20% inconvenience fee for your hardworking staff directly to my personal tab." Before Preston could open his mouth to laugh at my offer, I reached into my bag and pulled out a solid titanium American Express Centurion black card. The heavy metal caught the light of the crystal chandeliers as I casually tossed it onto the silver tray held by a nearby waiter. The venue manager's eyes widened in sheer shock. The Centurion card was not something you could just apply for online. It was strictly by invitation, only requiring millions of dollars in annual spending and massive verifiable liquid assets. It was the ultimate status symbol of the ultra-wealthy, a card Preston himself had been repeatedly denied for just last year. Preston stared at the heavy black titanium sitting on the silver tray, his mouth hanging slightly open as his brain short-circuited. "Charge the painting," I told the manager, keeping my tone perfectly polite but commanding. "And buy the venue a better security camera so you can see Caroline tripping over her own cheap heels." The entire ballroom went completely terrifyingly dead silent. The venue manager stared at the heavy black titanium card sitting on the silver tray as if it were a live grenade. He swallowed hard, nodded frantically, and scurried away to process the payment without uttering another single word. Caroline was still kneeling on the marble floor, her fake tears drying up instantly as she realized her vicious stunt had completely backfired. She looked utterly foolish. Preston realized he had rapidly lost the upper hand. The crowd was staring at him, whispering about his ex-wife, dropping $50,000 like it was pocket change. His face flushed with a toxic mix of deep embarrassment and rage. Desperate to regain his alpha status in front of the room, he grabbed Lexi by the wrist and dragged her away from the mess, steering her directly toward a tight circle of older, distinguished men in custom suits standing near the premium open bar. I did not chase after him. I smoothed my dress, stepped gracefully around the puddle of ruined wine, and walked calmly toward the bar myself. I ordered a double bourbon neat. As the bartender poured my drink, I could hear Preston aggressively pitching himself to the circle of men. These were not just any guests. These were the elite Silicon Valley venture capitalists. These were the men who had just pumped $20 million into his company. Preston noticed me standing nearby and saw an opportunity to rebuild his fragile ego by tearing me down in front of the people who controlled his financial lifeline. "Gentlemen," Preston announced loudly, gesturing toward me with a condescending smirk. "Let me introduce you to my past mistake. This is Madeline. She is my depressing ex-wife. She spends her entire life locked in a tiny cubicle crunching numbers for pennies at a mid-tier firm. She simply lacks the visionary mindset required to scale a real tech empire." The investors offered polite, uncomfortable chuckles, swirling the ice in their glasses. Lexi immediately chimed in, eager to play her part. She wrapped her arms around Preston and giggled, tossing her heavy hair extensions over her shoulder. "It is so true," Lexi chirped. "Madeline is just so incredibly negative." When Preston and I started dating, I told him he needed to surround himself with high-frequency energy. I literally manifested this entire lifestyle. I put it on my vision board, burned some sage to clear out the toxic energy Preston brought from his past marriage. And boom, we secured the $20 million Series A funding round the very next month. It is all about attracting wealth, not just sitting around doing boring math. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, letting the smooth heat coat my throat. I looked at the lead investor, an older man with sharp gray eyes, who was listening to Lexi talk about crystals with a thinly veiled expression of exhaustion. I knew exactly who he was, and I knew his firm was about to lose absolutely everything. "You know," I said quietly, addressing the lead investor directly and completely ignoring Preston and Lexi. "Manifestation is a fascinating concept for social media. But in my line of work, we tend to focus on the reality of liquidity traps." The older man raised an eyebrow, suddenly interested. "Oh," he asked, "and what exactly is your line of work, Madeline?" "I am a financial risk analyst," I replied smoothly, setting my glass down on the mahogany bar. "I specialize in identifying synthetic returns. For example, when a startup claims explosive algorithmic growth but heavily restricts third-party audits, it usually indicates a rapid capital burn rate. It means the new Series A money is not being used to scale technology. It is being used to pay off early-stage debt to create the illusion of profitability. A classic, catastrophic liquidity trap." The lead investor's polite smile vanished instantly. A deep, heavy frown formed on his face. The other men in the circle suddenly stood up straighter, their eyes darting sharply toward Preston. My words were not just a random observation. They were a highly technical coded warning, and these men were smart enough to catch the severe implication. They had just given Preston $20 million based on closed-door projections, and the ex-wife who supposedly built the original code was standing right here, telling them it was all a mirage. Preston panicked. The color completely drained from his face as he watched his lead investor's expression turn from friendly to deeply suspicious. His carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling right in front of him. "Shut your mouth!" Madeline Preston snarled, completely dropping his polished CEO persona. He lunged forward, his eyes black with fury, raising his right hand aggressively, as if he was actually going to grab me by the arm and physically drag me away from his investors. I did not flinch. But before his hand could even come close to my silk dress, a massive, heavy hand clamped down violently onto Preston's shoulder, stopping him dead in his tracks. The hand belonged to DeAndre. He was 38 years old, a brilliant African-American hedge fund manager, and the only person in Preston's entire family I actually respected. DeAndre was Caroline's husband, but unlike his insecure social climbing wife, DeAndre had built his massive wealth from the ground up. He stood 6'3" in a flawless midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo, radiating a calm, commanding presence that instantly dwarfed Preston's frantic energy. His heavy grip on Preston's shoulder was so powerful that Preston physically buckled his face, twisting in sudden pain, as he was forced to drop his arm. "Easy there, Preston," DeAndre said, his deep voice rumbling with a quiet, dangerous authority. "You do not want to wrinkle your custom Italian worsted wool right in front of your lead investors." Preston quickly stepped back, rubbing his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously between DeAndre and the older men watching the exchange. "I was just making a point," Preston stammered, trying to force a casual laugh that sounded more like a desperate wheeze. Madeline was just leaving. "Actually," DeAndre replied smoothly, stepping entirely between me and Preston. "Maddie and I were just about to catch up." He reached over to a passing waiter's tray, picked up a flute of vintage champagne, and handed it to me with a respectful nod. I took it, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. DeAndre turned his attention fully to the circle of Silicon Valley venture capitalists. The older men instantly recognized him. When you manage a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, your face commands immediate respect in any financial circle. The lead investor extended his hand, greeting DeAndre warmly, completely shifting the power dynamic away from the groom. I could not help but overhear the conversation regarding capital burn rates. DeAndre noted, casually taking a sip of his own drink. "It is a fascinating subject, especially today." He looked directly at the lead investor, completely ignoring Preston's sudden frantic attempts to change the subject. "You see," DeAndre continued, his tone conversational, but his words carrying the weight of a financial executioner. "I had a very interesting morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, the head floral designer threatened to pack up every single white rose in this venue and drive away. It seems there was a severe issue with the final payment, $40,000. Preston's face went completely white. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but DeAndre held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. "Now I thought it was just a simple administrative oversight," DeAndre said, projecting his voice just enough so the surrounding high society guests could eavesdrop. But when the vendor ran Preston's premium American Express Platinum card, it was completely declined. Insufficient funds. I had to personally swipe my own card just to make sure my brother-in-law here did not have to get married in an empty, undecorated tent. The silence returned, but this time it was suffocating. The lead investor's eyes narrowed into tiny, furious slits. The other men in the circle physically took a step back from Preston, creating a highly visible ring of isolation around the groom. In their world, a tech founder who had just secured $20 million in funding should never, under any circumstances, bounce a $40,000 vendor payment. It was the ultimate red flag. It verified every single thing I had just warned them about regarding synthetic returns and liquidity traps. Preston began to sweat profusely. Tiny beads of moisture gathered on his forehead, ruining his camera-ready makeup. It was a bank error. Preston stammered loudly, his voice cracking with pure panic. The fraud department flagged the venue's merchant code. My accounts are completely flush. The wire transfers are just stuck in the weekend holding cycle. None of the investors believed him. You do not get a card declined for fraud without receiving an immediate text alert to clear it. You get declined when the money simply is not there. The lead investor did not say a word. He just stared at Preston with a look of absolute chilling disgust, then slowly turned his back on the groom and walked away toward the exit. The others immediately followed his lead, abandoning Preston in the middle of his own wedding reception. Lexi stood there completely mortified, aggressively whispering at Preston to fix the situation. But Preston was paralyzed, watching his $20 million lifeline walk right out the front doors. DeAndre did not watch them leave. He turned back to me, raising his crystal champagne flute. He gently clinked the rim of his glass against mine. The high, clear sound rang out perfectly across the tense space. He leaned down slightly, a cool, calculating smile playing on his lips. The wolves are waking up. Maddie, DeAndre murmured quietly, his eyes locked onto mine. Finish him. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting DeAndre's words settle over me like a protective armor. He gave me one final knowing nod before stepping away to join a group of frantic, whispering guests. The damage was done. The lead investors were gone, and the entire ballroom was vibrating with the scandalous realization that the golden boy groom was completely broke. Preston stood frozen by the bar, staring at the double mahogany doors where his $20 million lifeline had just vanished. He looked like a man watching his own execution. But Lexi, ever the desperate opportunist, operated on a completely different frequency. Where Preston saw financial ruin, Lexi only saw a massive public relations crisis that needed immediate spin. She needed to reassure her 2 million online followers that her fairy tale wedding was absolutely perfect. Lexi suddenly appeared beside me, grabbing my forearm with perfectly manicured acrylic claws. Her grip was surprisingly tight, betraying the sheer panic hiding behind her heavily contoured face. Madeline, oh my gosh, Lexi squealed, her pitch artificially high, as she held up her sparkling smartphone, the ring light case already glaring brightly. We have to take a picture together for the story. Everyone thinks there is so much drama, but we are totally sister wives, right? We need to show the internet that we are all just one big happy blended family. Before I could pull my arm away, Lexi yanked me tightly against her side. She positioned the camera high above us, making sure her massive, unpaid diamond engagement ring was front and center in the frame. She plastered on a dazzling open-mouthed smile, leaning her head so close to mine that I could smell the overpowering scent of her synthetic floral perfume. I did not pull away. I did not frown. I knew there were dozens of wealthy guests watching us, waiting for me to snap and cause a massive scene. Instead, I tilted my chin up, found the glowing camera lens, and offered a perfectly serene, untouchable smile. Snap. The camera flashed, capturing the fake moment of unity, but Lexi did not lower her phone. She kept the lens pointed at us, pretending to record a quick video while she pressed her lips almost entirely against my ear. The bubbly, high-pitched influencer voice evaporated completely, replaced by a venomous, guttural hiss. "You think you are so incredibly smart," Lexi whispered rapidly, her teeth clenched behind her frozen smile. "You think coming here and scaring away a few old men changes anything. Preston chose me. He upgraded." I kept my eyes on this camera lens, my expression completely unchanged. I said nothing, letting her dig her own grave. Lexi leaned in even closer, twisting the knife. "By the way, I absolutely love the master bedroom in the penthouse, especially that custom Italian silk mattress you imported. It is incredibly comfortable. Preston told me you bought it hoping to start a family." He said it was such a tragic waste of money since your body could not even handle carrying a pregnancy past the first trimester. But do not worry, Madeline. He says we make a much better use of it anyway. I guess it just takes a real woman to give him what he actually needs. The words hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. The memory of the sterile hospital room, the blinding fluorescent lights, and the devastating silence of the ultrasound monitor rushed back into my mind. I remembered crying alone in that very bed while Preston was out at a networking event, claiming he could not handle my depressing energy. It was the most vulnerable, agonizing trauma of my entire life, and he had handed it to this 24-year-old stranger like a cheap piece of gossip to stroke her fragile ego. My blood ran completely cold. The urge to reach out and snap her phone in half was overwhelming. But then I remembered the heavy black titanium card in my purse. I remembered the encrypted files waiting on my tablet. I did not need to raise my voice or throw a tantrum. I already held the detonator to her entire fake life. I turned my head slightly, keeping my flawless camera-ready smile completely intact. I looked directly into Lexi's phone screen, making sure my face looked perfectly radiant for her 2 million followers. "Enjoy the bed, Lexi," I replied softly, my voice calm, melodic, and absolutely lethal. "Get a good night of sleep tonight." Because that custom Italian mattress, along with the penthouse, the luxury cars, and the fake diamond on your finger is going to be auctioned off by the federal government at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Lexi's dazzling smile instantly shattered. The camera flashed again, but her hand was suddenly shaking. She dropped her arms, staring at me as if I had just spoken to her in an alien language. I did not wait for her brain to catch up to the reality of her impending ruin. I simply offered her a polite, devastating nod, and walked away just as the grand chimes rang out, signaling the start of the formal dinner service. The remaining guests began to shuffle from the marble terrace into the main dining tent. I followed the crowd, my posture relaxed. Preston had instructed the event coordinator to place me at table 42, and he had kept his word. It was located in the absolute darkest, most remote corner of the massive tent. The table was shoved practically against the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed past, a blast of hot air, carrying the scent of industrial dish soap and burnt garlic, hit my table. The noise of clattering silverware and shouting chefs was deafening. I was seated with 3 very confused, low-level vendor assistants who looked terrified to even make eye contact with me. This was Preston's ultimate visual punishment. He wanted me to sit in the shadows eating cold food while watching him bathe in the spotlight at the elevated head table. But what Preston failed to understand was that the shadows are exactly where apex predators do their best work. A waiter hurriedly dropped a plate of dry, unappetizing chicken in front of me. I pushed it aside immediately. I reached into my oversized designer clutch and pulled out my iPad Pro. I set it flat on the table, resting it on the crisp white linen, and unlocked the screen with my fingerprint. The bright glow of the display illuminated my face in the dim corner. My screen was not showing a social media feed or a wedding registry. It was a highly classified, heavily encrypted financial command terminal. I opened 3 separate windows. The first window displayed a series of massive wire transfers. I was not just hacking his accounts. Over the past 6 months, I had meticulously tracked down every single one of Preston's toxic shell companies. When his creditors started panicking, I quietly stepped in through an anonymous proxy firm and bought his debt for pennies on the dollar. I was now his primary legally binding lien holder. He did not owe the banks anymore. He owed me. The second window on my screen contained 30 pages of expedited legal documents fully signed by a federal judge in the Northern District of California. These were immediate asset forfeiture warrants. The third window was my personal favorite. It was a live satellite GPS tracker displaying a blinking red dot on the tarmac of San Francisco International Airport. The dot represented Preston's leased Gulfstream private jet. He had planned to fly Lexi to the Maldives for a month-long honeymoon tonight. I watched the live feed as 2 black SUVs pulled up to the aircraft, blocking its path entirely. Federal authorities were seizing the plane at this exact second. I glanced up from my screen. Across the massive room, Preston was sitting at the lavishly decorated head table. He was sweating heavily, downing his third glass of whiskey, trying desperately to act like the sudden departure of his lead investors was just a minor hiccup. He was laughing too loud, slapping his groomsmen on the back, playing the part of the untouchable Silicon Valley king. He had absolutely no idea that the invisible digital noose I had woven was tightening around his neck with every passing second. I looked back down at my iPad. The hostile debt acquisition algorithm I had initiated was 99% complete. It just needed manual authorization to trigger the final irreversible asset freeze across all of his domestic and offshore accounts. It would lock him out of everything. No credit cards, no checking accounts, no emergency funds. Absolute financial zero. Suddenly, the ambient chatter in the massive tent faded. The grand chandeliers hanging from the ceiling went completely dark. A single blindingly bright spotlight pierced the darkness, hitting the center of the main stage. The crowd grew silent, turning their chairs toward the front. Preston stood up from the head table, straightening his cheap synthetic tuxedo jacket. He walked up the steps to the stage with a forced, arrogant swagger, grabbing the microphone off its stand. He tapped the metal grill twice. The sharp thud echoed through the silent room. He was ready to give his narcissistic groom speech, ready to spin his final web of lies to his remaining guests. I smiled from the darkness of my corner table. I looked down at the blinking authorization prompt on my screen. I calmly pressed enter. As soon as my finger lifted from the glass screen, a tiny green checkmark appeared, confirming the absolute lockdown of Preston's financial existence. It was done. While the digital guillotine silently dropped on his entire empire, Preston brought the microphone to his lips, utterly oblivious to his impending doom. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Preston began, his voice dripping with a practiced, buttery charm that he had spent years perfecting in mirror reflections. His eyes scanned the room, purposely avoiding the empty seats left by his fleeing investors. "Tonight is not just a celebration of love, it is a celebration of survival. It is about rising from the absolute bottom and building an empire with nothing but grit, vision, and the right woman standing by your side." He paused, letting the wealthy crowd absorb his fake humility. Lexi gazed up at him from the head table, her hands clasped against her chest, her eyes glistening with perfectly timed, camera-ready tears. "Many of you know me as a highly successful founder." Preston continued, lowering his voice into a dramatic, somber register. "But the journey here was incredibly dark. Before I met Lexi, I was trapped in a deeply toxic, emotionally abusive, and financially draining first marriage. I was tethered to an anchor of a woman who completely lacked ambition. She drained my energy, stifled my creativity, and constantly tried to drag me down to her mediocre level. I had to fight tooth and nail, practically starving just to protect my dreams from her relentless negativity." I sat in the shadows of Table 42, listening to him rewrite our history with effortless cruelty. He spoke of starving and fighting, yet he had never missed a single meal. My mind violently snapped back to the reality of those years. I remembered the bone-crushing exhaustion of working a grueling 50-hour week at the financial firm, only to rush across town to work a second job doing late-night corporate tax filings, just so we could afford the rent on our tiny apartment. I paid for every single semester of his elite MBA program. I bought his expensive textbooks, ironed his interview suits, and cooked his meals while he sat on the couch, complaining about how hard his classes were. And my absolute reward for carrying his dead weight for half a decade was delivered on the night of our 5th wedding anniversary. I had just made the final payment on his massive student loans. I booked a table at a nice restaurant to celebrate our future. Instead of a toast, Preston slid a manila envelope across the table, coldly handed me divorce papers, and told me he had outgrown my depressing, small-minded lifestyle. He had wrung me completely dry, stolen the trading algorithm I built during my rare hours of free time, and discarded me the exact second he secured his first round of stolen funding. And now he was standing in front of 400 people wearing a suit paid for by a Ponzi scheme, playing the ultimate tragic victim. But Lexi Preston said, his voice suddenly brightening, snapping me out of my memories. Lexi was my absolute salvation. She brought light into a life that had been suffocated by darkness. She did not just support my vision, she amplified it. She stood by me when I had nothing, and she helped me build a $20 million company with her boundless beautiful energy. She is my muse, my partner, and my equal. Lexi let out a delicate trembling sob, delicately wiping a tear from her cheek so she would not ruin her expensive makeup. The crowd offered a soft, sympathetic murmur. A few of Preston's groomsmen actually wiped their own eyes. It was a masterful, sickening performance. I took another sip of my bourbon, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I did not feel the urge to scream or interrupt his ridiculous monologue. I just sat patiently in the dark, watching a dead man brag about his future. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully rewritten his pathetic reality into a heroic self-made myth. He thought the narrative belonged entirely to him. But I am not a man who just offers empty words, Preston declared, his tone shifting from romantic to fiercely commanding. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking directly down at Lexi. In my past, I learned the hard way that you have to protect your assets from people who only want to drain you. But with you, Lexi, there are no walls. There are no boundaries. You gave me your entire heart, and tonight, I am going to prove my undying eternal loyalty to you in a way that no one can ever question. Preston reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a thick legal document bound in a blue leather portfolio. I have a surprise for my beautiful bride, he announced, holding the document high in the air. Something that will secure our legacy forever. Preston snapped his fingers with a theatrical flourish. At his precise signal, a massive white projection screen slowly descended from the vaulted ceiling of the dining tent, unfurling directly behind the lavish head table. The ambient lighting dimmed even further, ensuring all eyes were glued to the glowing rectangle. A high-definition projector flickered to life, casting a giant magnified image of the document he was holding in his hand. It was an intricate, highly detailed legal contract stamped with the official seal of a prominent California wealth management firm. I am a man who believes in putting my money exactly where my heart is. Preston declared, his voice echoing richly through the expensive surround sound speakers. When you find the woman who truly understands your vision, you do not hold anything back. You do not build cowardly safety nets. You go all in. He pointed dramatically at the giant screen behind him. What you are looking at is an irrevocable trust fund document. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I have officially and legally transferred 100% of my founder shares in my tech company directly into a private trust. This trust is established solely in Lexi's name. At our current Series A valuation, those shares are worth exactly $50 million, and they right now belong entirely to my beautiful wife. The ballroom erupted. The remaining guests, the sycophants and high society climbers who had stayed behind after the lead investors fled, clapped fiercely. They cheered at the sheer romantic audacity of giving away a $50 million tech empire on a wedding night. It was the ultimate fairy tale gesture, perfectly manufactured for the social media age. Lexi played her part flawlessly. She let out a loud theatrical gasp, covering her mouth with both hands to showcase her massive diamond ring. She stood up, her heavily beaded gown shimmering under the bright spotlight, and threw her arms around Preston's neck. She buried her face in his shoulder, visibly shaking as she produced loud, fake sobs of overwhelming joy. The hired videographer rushed forward, circling the couple to capture every single angle of Lexi's manufactured emotional breakdown for her millions of devoted followers. Over Lexi's shaking shoulder, Preston looked up. He stared out across the cheering crowd, his eyes piercing through the dim lighting, purposefully searching the back of the room until he found table 42. He found me sitting quietly in the shadows. He locked eyes with me. A slow, deeply arrogant smirk spread across his face, and he gave me a deliberate, highly exaggerated wink. I knew exactly what that wink meant. Preston was not just making a romantic gesture. He was executing what he firmly believed was a flawless financial evasion tactic. He knew his company was bleeding cash. He knew his creditors were circling, and he suspected I might try to come after him for the algorithmic assets he had stolen from me during our bitter divorce. By transferring every single share into an irrevocable trust under his new wife's name before the bankruptcy hit, he believed he had legally shielded his entire net worth. He thought he had outsmarted the banks, the federal regulators, and me. He thought the money was completely untouchable. It was a brilliantly devious plan for a man who learned everything he knew about corporate finance from internet forums. But for a certified financial risk analyst, it was the single dumbest, most catastrophic legal blunder a human being could possibly make in a community property state. He had just gift-wrapped his own legal execution. I sat back in my chair. The deafening applause and Lexi's loud fake sobbing filled the tent, but I could not hold it in anymore. A low, genuine laugh escaped my lips. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated amusement. My laughter cut sharply through the heavy garlic-scented air of the corner table, causing the 3 terrified vendor assistants sitting near me to jump in their seats and stare at me like I had completely lost my mind. I did not care who heard me. I picked up my phone from the very crisp white tablecloth. I opened my encrypted messaging app, selecting the chat thread I had kept completely dormant for the past 2 hours. The 2 men waiting patiently in the rented Rolls Royce out in the parking lot needed their signal. I typed out a single rapid message. Bring them in. He just handed us the kill shot. I hit send. I slipped the phone back into my designer clutch and slowly stood up from the table. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. It was time to show Preston exactly what happens when you try to play a high-stakes game of financial chess against the woman who originally built the board. I slowly stepped out from behind the heavy oak table. The harsh glare of the center spotlight did not reach my corner, but as I moved forward, the shadows melted away. My first step onto the polished hardwood floor of the main aisle produced a sharp, echoing clack. The sound of my stiletto heel hitting the wood was piercing, cutting right through the fading applause and Lexi's manufactured sobbing. I took another step. Clack. Then another. Clack. I did not rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate, predatory grace of a panther closing in on cornered prey. The hundreds of guests seated at the back tables turned their heads, conversations dying instantly as they saw me approaching. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders pulled back, my chin leveled. I did not look at the expensive floral centerpieces. I did not look at the bewildered venture capitalists or the whispering country club wives. My eyes were locked dead ahead, burning a hole directly into Preston's smug face up on the brightly lit stage. As I walked down the center aisle, the energy in the massive tent shifted violently. The attendees cheering for Preston's grand romantic gesture instinctively pulled their chairs in, shrinking back from the aisle. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path for me. They could sense the absolute zero temperature radiating from my presence. This was no longer a wedding reception. It was an execution chamber, and I was the one holding the axe. Halfway to the stage, the path narrowed between 2 large bridal party tables. Caroline was seated at the edge, wearing her hideous pink bridesmaid dress, nursing a fresh glass of wine after her humiliating cocktail room failure. She saw me coming. Her eyes narrowed with petty, vindictive spite. As I approached her chair, Caroline subtly shifted her weight and slid her right foot out directly into the center of the aisle, intending to trip me in front of 400 people. It was a pathetic, juvenile attempt to protect her brother's fragile ego. But my entire career was built on anticipating the clumsy, desperate moves of inferior opponents. I did not break my stride. I did not glance down at the floor. Instead of stepping over her outstretched leg, I calculated the exact trajectory of my next step and brought my right foot down with vicious surgical precision. The sharp metal tip of my stiletto heel drove directly into the soft arch of Caroline's foot. I shifted my weight forward, firmly pinning her foot to the hardwood floor. Caroline let out a strangled, breathless gasp of pure agony. Her face turned chalk white, her eyes bulging out of her head, but she could not scream without drawing the entire room's attention to the fact that she had just tried to trip a guest. She grabbed the table edge, her knuckles turning white, tears of actual pain springing to her eyes. I paused for a fraction of a second, standing completely still, with my heel buried into her foot. I finally looked down at her, offering a cold, terrifyingly blank stare. Caroline looked up at me, her lips trembling, completely paralyzed by the sheer dominance of the moment. I leaned in just a few inches. "Do not ever try to put an obstacle in my path again, Caroline," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd, "because I will simply walk right over you." I lifted my heel, ignoring her whimpering, and resumed my march toward the front of the room. I returned my gaze directly to the stage. Preston was still standing right near the microphone. The arrogant smirk plastered across his face moments ago was slipping. He watched me cut through his guests, struggling to comprehend why I was not cowering in the dark. He had expected me to run out of the venue crying after his brutal public humiliation. He had expected me to retreat. Seeing me march toward his stage with absolute unwavering confidence sent a shockwave of primal panic straight into his nervous system. I reached the edge of the dance floor, stopping exactly 5 feet away from the base of the stage stairs. I looked up at him, my expression completely unreadable. Preston's face morphed from confusion to sheer unadulterated panic. The sweat he wiped away all night returned beating rapidly on his forehead. He gripped the microphone stand so tightly his hands shook. He looked around the room, realizing no one was going to stop me. He yanked the microphone off the stand, his voice cracking loudly over the speakers. "Security!" Preston yelled frantically, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "Security! Get over here right now! Throw this crazy bitch out of my wedding right now before I call the police!" The echo of Preston's frantic command ripped through the tense atmosphere of the dining tent. Immediately, 2 massive security guards detached themselves from the shadows near the catering entrance. They were imposing figures built like linebackers, wearing tight black suits and earpieces. They began to march aggressively down the center aisle directly toward me. Their heavy boots thudded against the polished hardwood floor. The wealthy guests seated at the tables closest to the aisle physically recoiled, pulling their silk dresses and expensive suit jackets tightly against their bodies to avoid being caught in the impending physical altercation. Up on the stage, Lexi finally lowered her hands from her face. The fake, trembling tears instantly vanished from her cheeks, replaced by a cold, triumphant smirk that she could no longer hide. She honestly believed I was about to be forcibly dragged out of the venue, kicking and screaming. She thought my public removal would provide the ultimate humiliating finale to her meticulously manufactured fairy tale. The first security guard reached me. He was at least 6'5", his face set in a grim, professional scowl. "Ma'am," he said roughly, raising a massive calloused hand to grab my upper arm. "You need to come with us right now. Do not make this difficult." He never made physical contact. Before his thick fingers could even brush the silk fabric of my gown, I reached into my designer clutch with lightning speed. I did not pull out pepper spray. I did not pull out a phone to record him. I pulled out a thick tri-folded legal document heavily stamped with the blue seal of the United States Department of Justice. I thrust the document directly against the guard's broad chest, forcing him to instinctively grab it to keep the heavy paper from falling to the floor. "I am a cooperating witness in an active federal investigation," I stated, my voice projecting with absolute icy authority. "That is a federal subpoena. If you lay a single finger on me, you are physically assaulting a protected asset under the direct jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will not just lose your security license tonight. You will face up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for obstruction of justice." The guard froze. His eyes darted down to the heavy blue seal on the paper. He was just a private venue contractor paid $30 an hour to keep drunken wedding guests in line. He was absolutely not paid enough to interfere with the federal government. All the aggressive bravado instantly drained from his face. He quickly pulled his hands back, raising them in complete surrender. He looked at his partner, shook his head frantically, and both massive men took 3 large steps backward, completely abandoning their orders. Preston watched his hired muscle back down in sheer disbelief. His face morphed from panic into a violent animalistic rage. He grabbed the microphone stand, shaking it violently, as he leaned over the edge of the stage. "What are you doing?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over the high-definition speakers. "I pay you, grab her and throw her out of my venue right now." The guards refused to move. They stood flat against the wall, their eyes locked straight ahead, ignoring his unhinged demands. Preston was hyperventilating now. The pristine illusion of his perfect life was collapsing right in front of his elite social circle. Desperate to regain control to silence the reality of the situation, he spun around and pointed frantically at the 10-piece live band set up on the left side of the stage. "Play the music," Preston shrieked, waving his arms wildly. "Play something loud, drown her out, turn the volume all the way up right now." The band leader looked completely bewildered, but the aggression in Preston's voice made him panic. He quickly raised his baton, signaling the brass section. Suddenly, a jarring, aggressively upbeat pop anthem blasted through the massive surround sound speakers. The volume was absolutely deafening, vibrating the crystal glasses resting on the tables. It was a horrific clash of sound that only amplified the madness of the situation. Preston stood on the stage, his chest heaving, believing he had successfully drowned out my voice and regained control. I did not try to shout over the music. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood perfectly still in the center aisle, looking up at him with a chilling, victorious smile. The deafening pop music was just the pathetic soundtrack to his absolute downfall. Then it happened. Over the blaring horns and the heavy bass, a massive, thunderous crash resonated through the entire building. The sound was so violent that the floorboards actually shook beneath my stilettos. The massive 15-foot oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were violently kicked open from the outside. The heavy wood slammed brutally against the interior walls, cracking the expensive plaster. The sound engineer sitting at the mixing board panicked. He slammed his hand down on the master kill switch. The deafening pop music cut out instantly with a horrific metallic screech that made everyone wince. Absolute suffocating silence fell over the 400 guests. No one breathed. No one moved an inch. Standing in the grand threshold of the broken doors were 2 tall men. They were dressed in sharp, immaculate dark suits. Their eyes swept over the terrified crowd with clinical precision. Slowly, deliberately, they reached to their belts and pulled back their suit jackets, flashing the heavy, solid silver badges clipped to their waists. They stepped onto the hardwood floor and began the long walk down the center aisle. The 2 men moved with a synchronized heavy rhythm that commanded absolute authority. Every guest in the room turned their head to watch them pass. The venue security guards who had just threatened me pressed themselves completely flat against the walls, lowering their heads in deep deference to the federal badges. The men did not look at the expensive floral arrangements, the crystal chandeliers, or the terrified faces of the Napa Valley elite. They kept their eyes fixed dead ahead on the brightly lit stage where Preston was rapidly unraveling. Up on the platform, Preston was frozen. His mouth hung open, his chest heaving as he stared at the approaching figures. He recognized the threat instantly. Men who wear dark suits and silver badges to a billionaire wedding do not come to deliver congratulations. They come to dismantle empires. Lexi, however, was still operating on pure vanity. She grabbed Preston's arm, her voice a sharp, confused hiss, demanding to know who these men were and why they were ruining her perfect camera lighting. Preston did not answer her. He could not speak. He was locked in a state of absolute suffocating terror. I did not waste a single second of his paralysis. I turned my back to the approaching federal agents and gracefully ascended the carpeted stairs to the stage. My stilettos sank quietly into the plush fabric. I stepped right into the blinding beam of the center spotlight, sharing the elevated stage with my ex-husband and his new bride. Preston watched me approach with wide, bloodshot eyes. He was holding the microphone so tightly his knuckles were completely white, but his arms were shaking violently. I stopped directly in front of him. We were so close I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath and see the heavy beads of sweat ruining his expensive foundation makeup. He looked incredibly small in that moment, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado, reduced to nothing but a terrified, cornered fraud facing his own inevitable destruction. I reached out my hand. I did not ask for permission. I simply wrapped my fingers around the metal neck of the microphone and pulled it firmly from his grasp. Preston offered absolutely zero physical resistance. His fingers uncurled limply, surrendering the last shred of power he held in that room. The speakers let out a sharp, low hum of feedback as the microphone changed hands, signaling a massive shift in the power dynamic. Lexi finally realized the severity of the situation. Her fake bravado crumbled. She lunged forward slightly, her face twisted in rage, screaming at me to get off her stage and out of her wedding right now. I ignored her entirely. I did not even grant her the dignity of a glance. I turned my back on both of them, facing the sea of terrified faces in the dining tent. The two men in dark suits had reached the edge of the dance floor, stopping right at the base of the stage stairs. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking up at me, waiting for my cue. The entire room held its collective breath. You could hear a pin drop in the massive $2 million venue. The silence was heavy, thick with the anticipation of impending doom. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the high-definition surround sound system, crystal clear and utterly devoid of mercy. "Sorry to interrupt this beautiful fairy tale," I announced, my tone perfectly, even sweeping my gaze across the remaining venture capitalists and high society climbers. I know we were all incredibly moved by Preston's touching story of survival and his generous $50 million trust fund donation. It truly was a masterful performance. I paused, letting my words sink into the heavy silence. I glanced over my shoulder. Preston was leaning heavily against the head table, his legs practically giving out beneath him. But as a financial risk analyst, I continued turning back to the crowd. I am trained to look for discrepancies. And there is a glaring hole in Preston's meticulously planned narrative tonight. Despite spending $2 million to impress all of you, Preston forgot to invite two very important people to this celebration. I lowered my free hand and pointed directly at the taller of the two men standing at the base of the stage. He stepped forward into the edge of the spotlight, his silver badge gleaming under the bright lights. "Guests, investors, family members," I said, my voice ringing out like a final judgment. "Please meet Special Agent Mitchell, representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division." A massive collective gasp violently ripped through the shocked crowd. The collective gasp from the 400 guests sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The name of the Federal Bureau of Investigation hung heavily over the lavishly decorated tables like a death sentence. The wealthy venture capitalists who had lingered out of morbid curiosity suddenly looked terrified, their minds undoubtedly racing to calculate their own immediate legal exposure. On the stage, Preston physically staggered backward, his chest heaving. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the edge of the head table just to remain standing. His perfect, arrogant facade completely disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, trembling shell of a man who realized his fraudulent empire had just been raided. But I was not quite finished. An apex predator does not just wound its prey and simply walk away. I was here to dismantle every single lie they had built, brick by stolen brick. I kept the microphone pressed near my lips and shifted my gaze away from the federal agent. I gestured smoothly toward the second man standing at the base of the stairs. While Agent Mitchell looked like the Grim Reaper in a custom-tailored suit, this second man was a jarring contrast to the $2 million Napa Valley aesthetic. He was rugged, broad-shouldered, and distinctly out of his element. He wore a slightly faded off-the-rack blazer over a denim button-down shirt. His hands were thick and calloused with faint traces of motor oil permanently stained into the cuticles. He looked exactly like what he was, a hard-working blue-collar mechanic who had just been flown first class from a dusty town in Nevada straight into the epicenter of a high-society nightmare. Before I could even speak his name, the reaction came. It did not come from Preston. It came from the bride. Lexi suddenly let out a visceral, blood-curdling scream. It was not her usual high-pitched theatrical influencer squeal. It was a raw, guttural shriek of absolute, unadulterated panic. The massive custom-arranged bouquet of imported white orchids slipped from her trembling hands. It hit the hardwood stage with a pathetic thud, the delicate petals scattering violently across Preston's expensive leather shoes. She scrambled backward, her high heels catching on the heavy beading of her mermaid gown, nearly tripping over herself, as she tried to put distance between her and the man standing at the bottom of the stairs. Her heavily contoured face turned the color of wet ash. Preston snapped his head toward his new wife, utterly bewildered by her sudden violent meltdown. "Lexi, what is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with mounting hysteria. "Do you know this man standing down there?" Lexi could not even formulate an answer. She just shook her head frantically, pressing her hands over her face, as if covering her eyes would somehow make the mechanic disappear. "Allow me to clarify the situation for the groom," I announced, my voice cutting through Lexi's pathetic whimpering. I looked directly out at the sea of glowing camera phones that were now actively recording the stage. I wanted her 2 million followers to capture every single syllable of this revelation. "Guests, investors, and especially the groom," I said, projecting absolute authority. "Please meet Mason. He is a master mechanic from Henderson, Nevada. But more importantly, for tonight's festivities, Mason is Lexi's current legal husband." Another shockwave ripped through the ballroom. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Caroline, still nursing her bruised foot at the front table, let her jaw drop completely open. "Yes, you heard that correctly." I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, owning the space entirely. 3 years ago, long before Lexi rebranded herself as a manifestation guru and a high society muse, she married Mason in a very real, legally binding ceremony at a chapel in Las Vegas. And while she eventually packed her bags and moved to California to chase venture capitalist money, she conveniently forgot to file the actual divorce paperwork. They are still legally married today. Preston slowly turned his head to look at Lexi. His eyes were wide with a horrifying, devastating realization. The blood drained from his face. "Lexi," he finally gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me this is one of her crazy, bitter lies." Lexi was backed against the projection screen displaying the trust fund documents. She slowly lowered her hands, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "Preston, baby, please," she stammered frantically, her influencer voice completely breaking. "It was just a stupid Vegas mistake. It was 3 years ago. We were young and drunk. It does not mean anything. I swear it does not mean anything." I smoothly stepped between them. I looked at Preston, then at the crying bride, and offered a terrifying, brilliantly cold smile. "It might have been a Vegas mistake, Lexi," I said softly into the microphone. "But it is a mistake that just cost Preston absolutely everything." Preston stared at me, his chest heaving as his brain tried to process the collision of his personal and financial disasters. He looked from the bewildered mechanic to the massive projection screen displaying the trust fund. He shook his head aggressively, trying to reject the reality closing in. "You are completely insane," Preston hissed, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of rage and denial. "I do not care what scam you are pulling. It does not matter if she is married to him. That trust fund is ironclad. My lawyers drafted it specifically to protect my assets from bitter people like you. The shares are in Lexi's name. They belong to her, not him, and definitely not you." It was genuinely astounding how someone could operate a company while possessing such ignorance of basic family law. I raised the microphone again, my voice echoing with the precision of a risk analyst delivering a fatal corporate audit. "Preston?" I said calmly, pacing in front of the screen. "You are correct that your lawyers drafted an ironclad document. You successfully transferred 100% of your founder shares valued at $50 million directly to Lexi. The digital ink dried at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon. However, your legal strategy relied on one fundamental fatal assumption. You assumed that your marriage to Lexi today was legally valid." Lexi let out another loud, pathetic sob, sinking to her knees on the stage, her bridal gown pooled around her. Because Lexi never divorced Mason, I explained, looking out at the captive audience. Your grand $2 million wedding ceremony tonight is legally void. It is fraudulent. You are not her husband. You are just a very generous man who gave away his entire tech empire to a married woman. Preston gripped his hair, his perfect grooming completely ruined. "So what?" he shouted, his voice cracking over the speakers. "It is still her trust fund. It is still legally in her name." I turned to look at him, letting a cold smile spread across my face. That brings us to the absolute beauty of the California Family Code, Preston. As a resident of this state, you should have familiarized yourself with community property laws before you started playing shell games with your corporate assets. I gestured toward Mason, who was standing quietly next to the federal agent. Under California law, I continued, my voice projecting clear to the back of the room. Any asset acquired by or gifted to a married person while living in the state is automatically classified as community property. It does not matter whose name is on the legal document. Because Lexi is legally married to Mason, the absolute second you transferred your $50 million company into her name, exactly 50% of those assets instantly became the legal property of her husband. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could practically hear the gears turning in the minds of the venture capitalists as they realized the sheer magnitude of Preston's blunder. He had not protected his company. He had accidentally given half of it away to a mechanic from Nevada. Preston stumbled backward, knocking over a crystal water pitcher on the head table. It shattered loudly on the hardwood floor, splashing ice water all over Lexi's dress, but neither of them even flinched. "No," Preston gasped, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "No, that is impossible. I will fight it. I will hire a team of corporate litigators. I will tie this up in federal court for a decade. This grease monkey is not getting a single dime of my company." Mason finally spoke. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a dry chuckle. "Do not worry about me, buddy," Mason said, his voice completely unbothered. "I do not want anything to do with your fake tech company. I do not even know what a trading algorithm is." Preston blinked, a sudden glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes. He thought he could buy Mason off. He thought he could intimidate him. But Mason is a very practical man. I interrupted smoothly, delivering the final blow. He knew that fighting a corporate legal battle would be exhausting. He just wanted cash to fix up his auto shop. So rather than deal with lawyers, Mason made a brilliant financial decision. Yesterday morning, he signed a binding contract. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "He sold his 50% legal claim to your entire company directly to me," I announced, letting the words hang in the dead air. "I bought exactly half of your entire empire right out from under you, Preston. And I got it all for a bargain price of exactly $100,000. The reality of my words hung in the air before the absolute chaos erupted. Lexi stared at the piece of paper in my hand, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The calculation finally clicked in her head. The $50 million fairy tale she had been manifesting was completely gone. Her massive trust fund evaporated before she even had the chance to spend a single dime. The sweet, bubbly influencer persona she had meticulously maintained for her 2 million followers vanished instantly, replaced by the vicious reality of a scam artist who had just been scammed. She let out an ear-piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated fury and lunged directly at Preston. You promised me, she screamed, her perfectly manicured hands curling into tight fists as she started hammering them relentlessly against his chest. You told me you were a billionaire. You told me I would never worry about money again. You said this trust fund was mine. You ruined my life, you pathetic liar. You promised me a private jet and a house in Malibu. Look at me. I gave up my prime years for you. Preston stumbled backward, completely caught off guard by the violent assault from his new bride. He raised his arms to protect his face as Lexi's acrylic nails caught the edge of his cheek, leaving a bright red scratch down his jawline. The wealthy guests in the front row gasped in horror. Several venture capitalists pulled out their phones, completely abandoning any sense of decorum to record the absolute destruction of the golden boy. The flashing lights illuminated the stage like an active crime scene. "Get off me!" Preston roared, his voice cracking with humiliation and rage. He shoved Lexi hard by the shoulders, pushing her away with enough force that she stumbled backward and collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the stage, her heavy mermaid gown tangled around her legs, trapping her. She stayed on the floor, sobbing hysterically and pulling at her expensive hair extensions, completely ignoring the cameras flashing below. Preston did not even bother to check on her. He spun around his chest, heaving, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged hatred. He marched toward me, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He stopped just inches from my face, his breath hot and ragged, smelling of expensive whiskey and sheer panic. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Madeline?" He hissed, a desperate, manic gleam in his eyes. "You think you can just march in here with a grease monkey and a piece of paper and steal my company right out from under me? You are bluffing. This is all a pathetic, desperate bluff to ruin my wedding day because you are still obsessed with me. That contract you are holding means absolutely nothing in the real world." I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eye, holding the contract up between us. "It is a legally binding bill of sale, Preston. Signed, notarized, and filed with the state of California." He let out a harsh, barking laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "It does not matter," he shouted, turning to address the crowd as if he were delivering a brilliant legal defense in a courtroom. "Listen to me, everyone. She is lying. The trust fund transfer is not even finalized yet. I just announced it tonight. My lawyers only drafted the preliminary paperwork this morning. The digital escrow has not even cleared the banking system. It takes 24 to 48 hours for an irrevocable trust to become legally binding. The ink is not dry. The shares are still completely under my name." She bought half of absolutely nothing. He stood tall, a brief, desperate wave of relief washing over his face as he convinced himself he had found a legal loophole. He looked down at the federal agent standing at the bottom of the stairs, pointing an arrogant finger at him. "You see that?" Officer Preston sneered, his false bravado temporarily returning. "She is trying to commit corporate fraud right in front of you. You should be arresting her, not harassing me. My assets are completely secure and legally protected from her manipulation." The tall man in the dark suit did not blink. Special Agent Mitchell slowly placed his hand on the polished wooden railing and climbed the carpeted stairs to the stage. His movements were calm, deliberate, and radiating absolute authority. He stopped right next to me, turning his cold, professional gaze onto Preston. "Actually, Mr. CEO Mitchell," said his deep voice carrying clearly, without the need for a handheld microphone. "We subpoenaed your wealth management firm this afternoon. Your digital signature, timestamped at exactly 8:15 p.m. tonight, makes it very finalized. But honestly, that is the least of your problems." Special Agent Mitchell reached out his hand, and I gladly passed the microphone to him. He did not look at Preston or Lexi. He turned his attention directly to the audience, his eyes scanning the tables where the venture capitalists and high society guests were sitting in absolute frozen shock. When the FBI takes over a room, the air becomes incredibly dense. Nobody dared to take a sip of water or look at their phones. This was the terrifying reality of federal law enforcement crashing a billionaire masquerade. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of ultimate authority. "My division has been conducting a covert 6-month investigation into the financial operations of this supposedly groundbreaking technology firm. Many of you sitting in this room today have invested heavily in what you believed was a proprietary high-frequency trading algorithm. You were promised massive returns based on simulated data provided by the founder. Preston began to shake his head rapidly. He gripped the edge of the stage, his knuckles turning completely white. "No," he whispered, though his voice was swallowed by the sheer silence of the room. "Do not say it. Please do not say it. I regret to inform you," Agent Mitchell continued, completely ignoring the groveling CEO, "that there is no algorithm. The technology you invested in does not exist. It is a complete and total fabrication. The entire system is a hollow shell." A violent murmur ripped through the crowd. The remaining investors shot up from their chairs, their faces pale with sheer panic. One older man clutched his chest, realizing millions of his firm's capital had just vanished into thin air. Preston tried to lunge forward to grab the microphone back, but the second federal agent stepped up to the stage. He placed a heavy hand on Preston's chest and shoved him backward with effortless force. "That is a lie," Preston screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I have the patent. The patent is in my name. The code is real. We have been generating simulated returns for months. You do not understand the technology at all." I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Agent Mitchell. I did not need the microphone for my voice to carry to the frantic investors in the front rows. "He has a patent for an empty shell," I said, making sure every single investor heard me clearly. "Preston is not a coder. He does not know Python from a basic spreadsheet. When we were married, I built the entire trading algorithm from absolute scratch. I spent 2 years perfecting the predictive market models, and he stole my work to build his fake empire." Preston glared at me, his eyes wide with absolute hatred. "But the code works," he spat aggressively. "I saw the backtests." "You saw what I allowed you to see," I replied coldly. "Did you really think I was just going to let you throw me out into the freezing rain and hand over my life's work without a failsafe? The night you locked me out of the penthouse, I sat in a cheap motel room with my laptop. I did not just cry, Preston. I logged into the developer portal and permanently disabled the core processing script. I triggered a dead man's switch. The code you patented the very next morning was utterly useless. It could not execute a single real-world trade." The realization hit Preston like a physical blow to the stomach. He staggered backward again, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. He had spent the last 12 months pitching a dead product to some of the smartest financial minds in California, completely unaware that he was selling them a broken toy. Agent Mitchell raised the microphone again, silencing the panicked whispers of the investors. Because the core product was entirely non-functional, he explained, the suspect could not generate any legitimate revenue. To maintain the illusion of rapid growth and secure his Series A funding, he resorted to the oldest financial crime in the book, a classic Ponzi scheme. The word echoed off the canvas walls of the wedding tent. Ponzi. It was the ultimate dirty word in Silicon Valley. He used the initial seed money to pay off the early lenders. Mitchell continued outlining the devastating truth. He falsified corporate bank statements to show explosive growth, which in turn tricked the Series A investors into handing over $20 million just last month. I looked at the terrified venture capitalists, then down at the ruined bride, and finally fixed my gaze on Preston. "The $20 million you investors gave him did not go into tech," I said. "It went into his offshore accounts, Lexi's Cartier collection, and this $2 million wedding." Agent Mitchell reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The entire room held its breath as he extracted a thick, heavily folded document bearing the imposing seal of a federal magistrate judge. He did not wave it around theatrically. He held it with the calm, practiced grip of a man who dismantles fraudulent empires for a living. "This is a federal warrant for your immediate arrest," Preston Agent Mitchell stated, his voice echoing cleanly across the cavernous dining tent. "The charges include multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and international money laundering." A federal grand jury in the Northern District of California handed down the indictment early this morning. Preston backed away, shaking his head with violent, frantic jerks. His polished Italian shoes slipped slightly on the wet floor. "No," he stammered, his voice breathless and weak. You cannot do this right now. This is my wedding. You have to give me 24 hours to contact my legal team. I am a prominent tech founder. You cannot just walk in here and ruin my life based on her bitter lies. Agent Mitchell took a slow, methodical step forward, closing the distance between them. We do not operate on your social calendar, he replied coldly, and your life was ruined the moment you decided to defraud your investors. My team has spent the entire day systematically dismantling your financial infrastructure. You have absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Mitchell looked out at the terrified venture capitalists sitting in the front rows, ensuring they understood the absolute finality of the situation. As of 7 o'clock this evening, Mitchell announced federal marshals boarded your leased Gulfstream private jet on the tarmac at San Francisco International Airport. The flight crew was dismissed, and the aircraft was permanently impounded by the Department of Justice. Preston let out a choked guttural gasp. He reached up and grabbed the lapels of his own tuxedo jacket, as if he were suddenly struggling to breathe. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, his voice devoid of any sympathy. Acting on an emergency injunction filed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, we have executed a hard freeze on every single financial asset tied to your Social Security number and corporate tax identification. Your personal checking accounts, your offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands, and your corporate payroll accounts have all been seized. Even the credit cards in your wallet have been deactivated. You cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning, let alone retain a defense attorney. Preston backed up again, completely blind to his surroundings. He collided hard with the massive, elaborate ice sculpture displayed on the center of the stage. The sculpture, carved into the shape of two elegant swans, forming a heart, had been slowly melting throughout the evening. The impact caused a loud cracking sound to echo through the microphone. A heavy chunk of ice broke off one of the swan wings and shattered against the stage floor. Preston leaned heavily against the freezing, dripping structure, his custom suit instantly soaking up the icy water. It was a perfectly pathetic metaphor. His flawless, expensive facade was violently melting away under the glaring lights. The second federal agent, who had been standing silently by, stepped forward. He reached around to the back of his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy, solid steel handcuffs. The metallic jingling sound cut through the suffocating silence of the ballroom like a knife. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Agent Mitchell commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Preston did not comply. He just stood there, pinned against the melting ice swans, staring at the handcuffs with wide, unblinking eyes. The second agent did not wait for an invitation. He stepped right up to Preston, grabbed his right arm with forceful precision, and twisted it behind the groom's back. Preston let out a sharp cry of pain, but the agent was relentless. He grabbed the left arm, brought it back to meet the right, and snapped the cuffs onto Preston's wrists. The loud, definitive click of the locking mechanism signaled the absolute end of his fake Silicon Valley reign. The cold steel bit into his skin, forcing his expensive suit sleeves to bunch up awkwardly. The physical reality of the metal finally broke his mind. The arrogant, visionary CEO completely vanished. His legs suddenly gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto his knees right on the wet hardwood stage floor, bowing his head in front of the 400 high society guests he had tried so desperately to impress. He began to sob hysterically, a loud, wet, pathetic wailing that echoed terribly over the sound system. He frantically scanned the horrified faces in the crowd until his eyes locked onto the front table. "Mom." Preston screamed, his voice cracking with sheer childlike panic. "Mom, please, call your lawyers, use your money. Please, you have to help me." The agonizing sound of Preston begging for his mother echoed across the silent dining tent. Elaine stood frozen at the front VIP table. Her heavily powdered face was contorted in sheer terror, not just for her son, but for her own financial survival. Preston did not understand that there were absolutely no lawyers left to call. There was no family money left to save him. As I had whispered to her on the terrace just hours ago, she had already illegally drained her husband's retirement accounts to pay off her massive gambling debts. Now watching the steel handcuffs glinting under the bright stage lights, Elaine realized her personal ATM had just been permanently shut down. The entire family empire was collapsing, and she was going to be dragged down in the wreckage. Elaine knew she could not fight the FBI with a checkbook she no longer possessed. Desperate to halt the arrest and buy her son a few precious hours of freedom, she deployed her ultimate defense mechanism. She let out a sudden high-pitched blood-curdling shriek that pierced the tense air of the ballroom. She violently clutched her chest with both hands, her diamond rings flashing under the chandeliers. "Oh my God!" Elaine gasped, her voice breathless and strained. "My heart is giving out. I cannot breathe." She stumbled dramatically backward, knocking over two heavy wooden dining chairs. The loud clatter added to the terrifying chaos. Caroline rushed to her mother's side, screaming hysterically for someone to call an ambulance. Elaine collapsed onto the Persian rug, gasping for air like a dying fish, her eyes rolling back into her head in a magnificent display of amateur acting. The sudden medical emergency sent a shockwave of panic through the remaining guests. Several wealthy investors pulled out their cell phones, frantically dialing for emergency services. Even Special Agent Mitchell paused for a fraction of a second, his strict protocol requiring him to properly assess any potential medical threat during an active arrest. Preston began screaming uncontrollably from the stage, thrashing against the agent's grip, begging the authorities to let him go so he could say goodbye to his dying mother. The entire $2 million wedding reception descended into absolute pandemonium. But from my vantage point on the elevated stage, looking down at the writhing woman on the floor, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculated clarity. I had spent years watching Elaine fake debilitating migraines, to avoid cooking fake panic attacks to manipulate my former father-in-law, and fake tears to get her way at country club board meetings. I knew a fabricated crisis when I saw one. I calmly descended the carpeted stage stairs, bypassing the panicked bridesmaids crying in the corner. I walked slowly. I stopped at the nearest beautifully decorated dining table, picked up a heavy crystal water pitcher, and filled a large highball glass to the absolute brim with freezing ice water. I walked directly over to where Elaine was laying on the floor. Caroline was kneeling right next to her, sobbing loudly and frantically fanning her mother's face with a white linen cloth napkin. "Move out of the way, Caroline," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal frequency that made Caroline instinctively scramble backward across the floor. I stood directly over my ex-mother-in-law. She was still clutching her chest, letting out weak, pathetic groans, keeping her eyes squeezed tightly shut to maintain the elaborate illusion of cardiac arrest. I did not hesitate for a single moment. I tilted my wrist and poured the entire glass of freezing ice water directly onto Elaine's perfectly styled hair and heavily powdered face. The icy shock was instantaneous and violent. Elaine let out a sharp, incredibly healthy screech. Her eyes flew wide open in pure shock. "Save the acting, Elaine," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the horrified guests gathering around us. "Do not waste the paramedics' time tonight. Your premium health insurance was tied directly to Preston's corporate account, which as of an hour ago is completely bankrupt. If they load you into that ambulance, you will be paying the $10,000 medical bill out of your own empty pocket." The miraculous healing powers of financial ruin took immediate effect. Elaine sat up so fast you would have thought she was struck by lightning. The dying act vanished into thin air. She wiped the dripping water from her mascara-stained eyes, glaring up at me with a look of pure venom. She was breathing perfectly fine. The wealthy crowd surrounding us took a collective step back. The panicked murmurs instantly transformed into audible scoffs of absolute disgust at the family's pathetic, transparent display. The collective scoffs from the wealthy crowd surrounding us were the final nails in the coffin of the family's reputation. Elaine sat on the wet floor, shivering and completely exposed as a manipulative fraud. Preston was still sobbing on the stage, his hands locked in federal steel. But while Elaine and Preston had both played their last pathetic cards, Caroline was experiencing a complete psychological fracture. She stood over her dripping mother, her hands trembling violently. The perfect aristocratic facade she had spent her entire adult life cultivating was disintegrating right before her eyes. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the country club wives she had always tried to impress. They were looking at her not with sympathy, but with absolute unfiltered revulsion. Caroline could not handle the humiliation. Her fragile narcissistic ego simply snapped under the immense pressure of public disgrace. She turned her wild bloodshot eyes toward me. In her warped mind, I was the sole architect of her destruction. I was the reason her golden boy brother was going to federal prison. I was the reason her mother was sitting in a puddle of ice water. She let out a guttural, animalistic scream that tore through her vocal cords. Without a single ounce of rational thought, she spun around and reached for the beautifully set table behind her. Her hand bypassed the crystal wine glasses and the expensive floral centerpieces wrapping tightly around the heavy serrated handle of a silver steak knife. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Caroline charged at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged hatred. The heavy pink fabric of her bridesmaid dress rustled violently as she closed the distance. Several guests screamed in absolute terror and scattered, knocking over chairs in their desperate attempt to get out of her path. She raised the serrated knife high above her shoulder, the polished silver gleaming dangerously under the crystal chandeliers, aiming directly for my chest. I did not flinch. I did not take a step back or raise my arms to defend myself. My mind calculated the desperate, sloppy trajectory of her strike in a millisecond. But before I even needed to shift my weight to evade her clumsy attack, a towering figure stepped seamlessly into her path. DeAndre moved with a terrifying absolute stillness that contrasted violently with Caroline's manic energy. He did not shout, he did not panic, he simply stepped between us, planting his feet firmly on the polished hardwood floor. As Caroline brought the knife down with all her might, DeAndre raised his left hand and caught her wrist mid-air. His grip was like a steel vise. The forward momentum of her charge was halted instantly, causing her to collide heavily against his solid, unmoving chest. Caroline gasped, struggling frantically against his iron grip. "Let me go!" she shrieked, kicking wildly at his legs. "She ruined everything. She ruined our family. Let me go!" DeAndre did not say a word. He just stared down at the woman he had married, his face completely devoid of any affection, warmth, or even anger. There was only pure, unadulterated contempt. With a smooth, practiced twist of his wrist, he applied precise pressure to a nerve bundle in her forearm. Caroline let out a sharp yelp of pain. Her fingers involuntarily spasmed open. The heavy silver steak knife slipped from her grasp and clattered harmlessly onto the floor, skidding underneath a nearby catering table. He held her by the wrist for one more excruciating second, forcing her to look him directly in the eyes. The absolute disgust radiating from him finally pierced through her blinding hysteria. Caroline stopped struggling. Her manic screams died in her throat, replaced by a sudden terrifying realization that she had just tried to commit a violent felony in front of 2 federal agents and 400 high society witnesses. DeAndre released her wrist with a sharp, dismissive shove. Caroline stumbled backward, clutching her bruised arm, her chest heaving as she stared up at her husband. She expected him to protect her, to shield her from the consequences of her actions, just like he always did. She waited for him to smooth things over with his massive wealth. But DeAndre simply adjusted the lapel of his midnight blue tuxedo. He reached inside his tailored jacket and retrieved a thick, heavily sealed manila folder. He did not hand the documents to her. He raised the heavy folder high and slammed it down onto the nearest dining table with a brutal force that made the crystal glassware rattle and ring. The sharp sound cut through the lingering murmurs of the terrified crowd like a gunshot. He leaned forward, resting both hands flat on the table, and leveled a lethal, unforgiving glare at his wife. "I told you to stop stealing from our family, Caroline." The words hung in the air, heavier than the suffocating silence that had consumed the room. Caroline flinched as if she had been struck. She stared at the manila folder resting on the white linen tablecloth, her eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing dread. The country club wives who had been watching her meltdown exchanged shocked glances. DeAndre did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet, commanding tone was far more terrifying than any scream. He reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the folder. Inside was a meticulously organized stack of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and highlighted financial audits. For the past 3 months, DeAndre said, his voice echoing coldly across the dining tent, I noticed strange discrepancies in our secondary investment accounts. I initially thought it was a simple banking error, but when I hired an independent forensic accountant to dig deeper, they found a very sophisticated, very desperate trail of digital breadcrumbs. Caroline shook her head frantically, stepping backward. DeAndre, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. Do not do this here. Not in front of everyone. Let us go home and talk about this privately. We do not have a home anymore, Caroline. DeAndre replied smoothly, cutting off her pleas. Because you decided that maintaining your brother's fake billionaire image was more important than your own children. He picked up the top sheet of paper and held it up for the surrounding guests to see. He looked directly at Preston, who was still kneeling on the stage in handcuffs, and then back at his wife. When Preston's creditors started breathing down his neck last month, DeAndre explained. Caroline panicked. She knew that if Preston's company collapsed, the family's elite social standing would evaporate. She could not bear the thought of being the sister of a bankrupt fraud, so she took matters into her own hands. DeAndre dropped the paper back onto the table. Over the course of 4 weeks, he stated, his voice hardening into absolute steel, my wife secretly authorized 3 separate wire transfers. She funneled exactly $500,000 out of our private accounts and directly into Preston's offshore shell companies to help him hide his Ponzi scheme tracks from the federal regulators. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the remaining crowd. Stealing was one thing, but stealing to fund a federal crime was a completely different level of depravity. But that is not even the worst part. DeAndre continued, taking a slow step toward her. His eyes were burning with a fierce, protective rage. If you had stolen from my personal hedge fund dividends, I would have just fired you as my wife. But you did not touch my money, Caroline. You bypassed the security protocols on our family trust. You drained the $500,000 directly out of our children's college education funds. The room erupted into disgusted murmurs. Caroline covered her face with her hands, letting out a wretched, shameful sob. She could not deny it. The evidence was sitting right there on the table, verified by a forensic accountant. She had robbed her own children to protect her toxic brother. I gave you everything, DeAndre said, quietly shaking his head. I gave you the penthouse, the black cards, the perfect society life you always craved. And you used my trust to fund a criminal. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket one last time. He pulled out a thin, crisp white envelope and dropped it onto the manila folder. That is why I spent my morning at the courthouse while you were getting your hair and makeup done. My lawyers filed for divorce at exactly 1 o'clock this afternoon. The paperwork inside that envelope also includes an emergency injunction granting me immediate sole physical and legal custody of our children. Caroline lowered her hands, her face completely pale. No, she gasped, her voice breaking. You cannot take my babies away from me. I am their mother. You are a financial liability and an accessory to federal wire fraud, DeAndre corrected her coldly. I have already instructed my private security team to pack your personal belongings. You have until exactly midnight tonight to return to the penthouse, collect your bags from the service elevator lobby, and leave my property forever. If you try to step foot inside the actual apartment or go near the children, my guards will have you arrested for trespassing. The finality of his words struck her like a physical blow. The glittering, perfect facade Caroline had spent years building shattered completely. She realized she had destroyed her marriage, alienated her children, and publicly humiliated herself beyond any repair. She dropped to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably in her pink dress, her wealthy life crumbling into dust. The sight of Caroline collapsing onto the floor, utterly broken by her own husband, was the final catalyst the room needed. Until this exact moment, The 400 wealthy guests had been paralyzed by morbid curiosity, treating the unfolding disaster like an exclusive live-action drama. They had their phones out recording every humiliating detail of the groom being handcuffed and the mother being exposed. But when DeAndre openly discussed forensic accountants' wire fraud and the draining of trust funds, the entertainment value instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a sudden icy wave of legal terror. These were not just ordinary wedding guests. These were elite Silicon Valley venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and prominent socialites. They operated in a world where proximity to a federal financial crime could trigger devastating audits into their own personal holdings. The realization hit the crowd simultaneously. Being photographed or recorded at a $2 million party funded by a massive Ponzi scheme was a public relations nightmare. But being subpoenaed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a material witness was a career-ending catastrophe. A distinguished man in the second row, a senior partner at a massive corporate law firm, was the first to react. He abruptly stood up, grabbed his terrified wife by her wrist, and practically sprinted toward the side exit of the dining tent. That single movement broke the dam. Absolute, unadulterated panic erupted. The mass exodus was not orderly or polite. It was a vicious, animalistic stampede of the ultra-wealthy desperately trying to save their own skins. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor, dozens of them tipping over and crashing down as people frantically pushed away from their dining tables. Women in incredibly expensive designer gowns hiked up their skirts, completely abandoning their poised elegance as they shoved past each other. Men in bespoke tuxedos shoved their way into the aisles, stepping over knocked-down chairs and discarded silk wraps. The sheer volume of people rushing toward the main entrance created a violent bottleneck at the broken oak doors. A country club wife, one of Elaine's friends, who had mocked me in the parking lot, tripped over the hem of her own dress. She fell hard against a massive, towering pyramid of crystal champagne coupes that had been meticulously stacked near the entryway. The entire structure wobbled for a split second before completely collapsing. Hundreds of fragile crystal glasses rained down, shattering into thousands of razor-sharp fragments across the floor. The expensive vintage champagne flooded the expensive Persian rugs, mixing with the dirt tracked in by the fleeing crowd. The destruction of the $2 million ballroom was absolute and deeply poetic. The lavish floral centerpieces featuring thousands of imported white orchids were knocked off the tables, their delicate petals crushed beneath the stampeding heels of the fleeing elite. Plates of half-eaten gourmet food, dry-aged steaks and butter-poached lobster, were upended, splattering across the pristine white linen tablecloths. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments on the balcony, leaving a priceless cello tipped dangerously over the railing. The venue staff, realizing they were definitely not getting paid for the evening, did not even attempt to restore order. The bartenders grabbed whatever top-shelf liquor bottles they could carry and vanished through the service doors. The waitstaff retreated into the catering kitchen, locking the heavy metal doors behind them to avoid the chaos. I stood near the front table watching the frantic evacuation with absolute calm. I did not move an inch as the crowd surged past me, their faces pale with fear. They were running back to their luxury cars, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Preston's collapsed empire. In less than 5 minutes, the massive chaotic stampede completely dissolved into the night. The deafening noise of the fleeing crowd faded, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. The only sounds left in the cavernous dining tent were the dripping of melting ice from the shattered swan sculpture on the stage, the crunching of broken crystal settling on the floor, and the pathetic, ragged sobbing of the family I had just dismantled. The opulent fairy tale was dead. The $2 million venue looked like the aftermath of a violent hurricane. Overturned chairs, ruined food, and shattered glass stretched out as far as the eye could see. The bright stage spotlights still beamed down relentlessly, but there was no one left to perform for. The dust settled over the devastating scene. The massive room was entirely empty, save for a few solitary figures standing amidst the wreckage. There was only me, DeAndre Mason, the 2 federal agents, and the shattered crying remnants of a family that had finally been buried alive, under the crushing weight of their own toxic greed. Agent Mitchell broke the heavy silence that had settled over the ruined $2 million ballroom. "Let us go, Preston!" The agent commanded, his voice completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. He grasped Preston firmly by the right bicep, hauling him roughly to his feet. The second federal agent mirrored the motion on the left side. Preston's legs were shaking so violently they could barely support his own weight. The freezing water from the shattered ice swan dripped steadily down his ruined synthetic tuxedo, leaving dark, pathetic stains across the expensive fabric. He looked completely hollowed out, a ghost haunting the massive, glittering graveyard of his own making. As the federal agents began to march him toward the broken oak doors, Preston suddenly dragged his feet. He planted his expensive leather shoes hard against the hardwood floor, fighting just enough to stall their forward momentum. The agents yanked his arms, the heavy steel handcuffs clinking sharply, but Preston twisted his neck. His tear-streaked face frantically searched the wreckage of overturned tables and crushed orchids until his bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. "Madeline, wait," Preston choked out. His voice was a pathetic, raspy whisper that cracked under the weight of his terror. "Please, Maddie. Just wait 1 second." Agent Mitchell paused, exchanging a brief professional glance with his partner. They stopped walking, allowing the broken man a final, pathetic moment of humiliation. I did not rush. I slowly walked toward him, navigating the shattered crystal champagne flutes and trampled white linens scattered across the dance floor. I stopped exactly 2 feet away, keeping my posture perfectly straight. He looked absolutely wretched. The arrogant, visionary Silicon Valley titan had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified, weeping child begging for salvation. "Maddie, please." Preston sobbed, the tears flowing freely down his face, ruining the last traces of his camera-ready makeup. "You do not have to do this. You can tell them to stop. We can fix this together. Remember the good years? Remember that tiny, freezing apartment in the city? We loved each other. We built this foundation together. You know I never meant to hurt you. I just got lost in the pressure. I got greedy. But deep down I am still the exact same man you married. Please just forgive me. Help me." He was actually begging for mercy from the very woman he had systematically destroyed. He honestly believed he could reach into the past and pull out the naive, endlessly supportive wife who used to work double shifts just to pay his tuition. He thought a few tears and a pathetic, desperate apology could erase years of calculated, malicious betrayal. I analyzed his face, reading the micro-expressions like a financial spreadsheet. These were not tears of genuine remorse. They were the panicked tears of a trapped predator finally facing the absolute consequences of his actions. I stepped in closer. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger, bitterness, or even vindictive joy. I looked at him with cold, iron boundary logic. The man I married died a very long time ago. "Preston?" I said, my voice perfectly steady, cutting cleanly through his pathetic sobbing. "He died on the night of our 5th wedding anniversary. I remember that evening vividly. I remember handing you the final receipt for your massive student loan payment. And I remember you looking me dead in the eye, sliding a manila envelope across the table, and handing me divorce papers." Preston flinched, squeezing his eyes shut as the reality of his own cruelty hit him. "Do you remember what you called me that night?" I asked quietly. "Do you remember what you said when I begged you to tell me why you were leaving? Why you were taking the trading algorithm I built with my own 2 hands?" He shook his head frantically, too ashamed to speak the words aloud in front of the federal agents. "You called me a worthless parasite," I reminded him, making sure every single syllable landed with lethal precision. "You told me I lacked the vision to exist in your elite world. You said I would spend the rest of my miserable life crunching numbers in a tiny cubicle while you changed the universe. You threw me out into the freezing rain with absolutely nothing, Preston. You stole my life's work, patented it under your own name, and built this entire fraudulent fantasy on my broken back." Preston hung his head in absolute defeat, his chest heaving with deep, racking sobs. I am sorry, he whimpered into his chest. I am so sorry. I know you are, I replied smoothly. But apologies do not pay back $20 million in stolen federal funds, and they certainly do not clear your massive corporate liabilities. Preston looked up, his eyes widening in sudden fresh confusion. What are you talking about? I leaned in so close that only he and the federal agents could hear my final devastating sentence. You see, Preston? I did not just buy Mason's 50% legal claim to your fake company. As a risk analyst, I know how to navigate secondary markets. I used the tiny severance package from our divorce to quietly buy up all of your remaining toxic corporate debt through an anonymous proxy firm. Every single penny you owe to those offshore lenders, every defaulted loan you now legally owe directly to me. Preston stopped breathing. The sheer magnitude of his permanent financial doom finally settled over his shattered mind. When you finally get out of federal prison in 20 years, I whispered, my voice completely devoid of mercy, you will have absolutely nothing. You will be a convicted felon forced to work a minimum wage job just to survive, and I will be right there waiting. I will garnish your pathetic minimum wage paycheck every single week until the day you die. Agent Mitchell did not offer a single word of commentary. He simply gave a sharp, definitive nod silently, acknowledging the absolute finality of my execution. He and his partner turned in perfect synchronization, dragging Preston's limp, trembling body toward the shattered oak doors. Preston did not fight back. He did not look over his shoulder. The arrogant defiance had been entirely drained from his hollow shell. I watched them march him through the wrecked ballroom, his expensive Italian leather shoes dragging pitifully across the ruined Persian rugs. They pushed through the broken entrance, shoved him roughly into the back of a heavily armored black SUV, and slammed the heavy door shut completely, swallowing him into the federal justice system. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the cool night air filtering in from the outside. The heavy, suffocating stench of fake floral arrangements and desperate corporate greed was finally dissipating. I adjusted my designer clutch and walked out of the $2 million tomb, stepping onto the gravel driveway of the resort. The scene outside was equally pathetic. Lexi was sitting right on the dirty concrete curb under a flickering street lamp. The bottom half of her custom-beaded mermaid gown was completely torn, stained with mud, and spilled red wine from the fleeing guests. She was clutching her cell phone with a white-knuckled grip, screaming frantically at someone on the other end of the line. It was clearly a high-priced crisis attorney who had just informed her that a massive cash retainer fee was required before they would even consider taking the case of a fraudulent, doubly married influencer. She shrieked, threw her phone violently onto the pavement, where the screen shattered into a spiderweb of glass, and buried her face in her hands. Her fake Silicon Valley fairy tale was ending in a puddle of muddy tears. I did not stop to offer her a single word of sympathy. I walked right past her. As I approached the designated valet circle, a tall figure emerged from the shadows of the manicured hedges. DeAndre stood there, still looking immaculate and entirely unbothered in his midnight blue tuxedo. He held two crystal champagne flutes miraculously salvaged from the absolute chaos inside the venue. He extended one toward me. I took it, feeling the cool crystal against my fingers. He did not offer a grand, dramatic speech. He simply raised his glass. "Thank you, Maddie," DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying a profound sense of genuine relief. "You did not just expose a massive financial fraud tonight. You gave me the undeniable clarity I needed to cut the toxic cancer out of my own life. I am walking away a completely free man." I smiled, raising my glass to meet his. We gently clinked the rims together. The crisp, high sound rang beautifully in the cool California night air. "To freedom," I replied softly. He nodded in absolute agreement, took a slow sip of his vintage champagne, turned on his heel, and walked toward his waiting private town car. He was leaving his disastrous marriage and Caroline's hysteria far behind him, returning to a life of clean money and sole custody of his children. I drained the rest of my champagne, set the empty flute elegantly on a stone pillar, and walked toward the sleek black Rolls Royce, idling quietly in the circular driveway. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy armored rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, greeted by the quiet professional nods of the two proxy associates I had hired to manage my new physical asset seizures. I settled into the plush seat and pulled my iPad Pro from my clutch. The screen glowed softly in the dark cabin, displaying one final, pending legal document. It was the absolute foreclosure deed for Preston's luxury Silicon Valley penthouse estate. Because I now legally owned the entirety of his toxic corporate and personal debt, I had the supreme authority to seize his collateral. The prompt on the screen required a purchase price for the mandatory transfer of the deed. I tapped the glowing screen, entering the exact legally binding amount of $1. I used my digital stylus to sign my name smoothly across the dotted line. The transaction instantly cleared with a bright green checkmark. For $1, I now owned the very home he had ruthlessly kicked me out of. The driver gently shifted the heavy vehicle into gear. The Rolls Royce glided smoothly away from the resort, leaving the flashing red and blue police lights and the ruined lives rapidly fading in the rearview mirror. As we merged onto the open coastal highway, I looked out the tinted window. The Napa Valley sky was bursting with the brilliant fiery colors of a setting sun. For years, society had conditioned me to be the quiet, supportive wife. I was told to shrink myself to suppress my own brilliance so a mediocre man could feel tall. They expect discarded women to disappear quietly into the shadows, crying over lost time and stolen algorithms. But they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of a woman who finally recognizes her own terrifying worth. We do not shrink. We do not fade away into polite obscurity. When they try to burn us to the ground, we do not perish in the flames. We let the fire burn away our illusions. We collect the ashes, and we use them to build a completely untouchable empire. I leaned back into the soft leather, feeling the immense exhilarating weight of my reclaimed power. The sun finally dipped below the rolling hills, and for the first time in 5 years, my horizon was absolutely limitless.